Hello and welcome to Chapter 8 of our FSBC 8 curriculum on preventive controls for animal food. In this chapter, we are going to cover sanitation preventive controls and their management components. Here are the objectives for this chapter. One of the big objectives that we want you to walk away with is understanding the difference between sanitation CGMPs and sanitation preventive controls. And if you already understand the difference between CGMPs and preventive controls, you're probably on the right track for understanding the difference between sanitation CGMPs and sanitation controls. We read a lot about general cleanliness and general sanitation in the CGMP chapter in Chapter 2, and now we're going to take a look at what that might look like in the form of a preventive control. So we'll definitely discuss the purpose and the importance of sanitation preventive controls, and we'll talk about the required management components for sanitation preventive controls. Just to kind of orient ourselves, these were our preventive control categories. In Chapter 7, we covered process preventive controls and their management components. Here we are in the green circle in sanitation controls. Chapter 9 will cover the supply chain applied controls. Here's the regulation on sanitation controls. This is 507.34C2. Sanitation controls include procedures, practices, and processes to ensure that the facility is maintained in a sanitary condition adequate to significantly minimize or prevent hazards, such as environmental pathogens and biological hazards due to employee handling. Sanitation controls must include, as appropriate to the facility and the animal food, procedures, practices, and processes for the cleanliness of animal food contact surfaces, including animal food contact surfaces of utensils and equipment, and prevention of cross-contamination from insanitary objects and from personnel to animal food packaging material, and animal food contact surfaces, and from raw product to processed product. So a few important things in here. First of all, these are meant to maintain a facility in a sanitary condition, not just general cleanliness, but maintained in a sanitary condition that's adequate to minimize or prevent those hazards. Environmental pathogens and biological hazards are specifically mentioned here, and I think we're going to most often see that sanitation controls are used to significantly minimize or prevent those biological hazards, those pathogens, those microorganisms. Sanitizing is a way that we can kill microorganisms. The two main focuses of sanitation controls are right there in those sub-bullet points. Number one being animal food contact surfaces, making sure they're clean, making sure they're sanitized. And then number two, preventing cross-contamination, whether that's from other objects, packaging materials, or from raw product to processed product especially. So sanitation control is a type of preventive controls. It's used to control a hazard when we decided that it is a hazard requiring a preventive control. Specifically, sanitation controls are most appropriate to control environmental pathogens and pathogens transferred through cross-contamination. When we looked at the GMP section of this regulation, we saw a lot of things that talked about or dealt with general cleanliness or even direct sanitation, like the sanitation section 507.19. That kind of closely relate to sanitation controls. So these are just a list of some of those different sections where we talked about cleanliness and about employee hygiene and personnel not contaminating our product. And where we kind of shift from this GMP world to the preventive control world is in that hazard analysis process. So we're probably already doing a lot of general cleanliness and sanitation things within our GMP program and within our SOPs. But when we go through that hazard analysis process and we look at each of these hazards and decide how likely they are to occur and what kind of severity they could have if they were to occur, then we can kind of make that decision of whether we want to keep a closer eye on them or not. And that's really where we go from the GMP world to the preventive control world. So all of these GMPs could potentially turn into a preventive control if we decide we need one, and then we start implementing some of those management components that we've been talking about. So if we're doing more record keeping, we're doing more monitoring, we're doing the validation and verification and all of those steps, all the corrective actions as well, that's really what distinguishes a GMP from a preventive control. It's that level that we are monitoring and that closer eye, that closer lens that we're keeping on this particular process or this particular action, because it could have such an impact, and the risk level is so much higher in that situation. So to simplify this, really these are the goals of sanitation controls. Number one, protecting those animal food contact surfaces. Those are absolutely critical. I mean, they are contacting our product, so keeping those clean and sanitized is a critical part of a sanitation control. And then a secondary piece is going to be that prevention of cross-contamination. So that means from things like objects or personnel, or from raw product to processed products. So that's going to be establishing procedures to make sure that we have sanitary conditions and we're not cross-contaminating any of our products. And to think about animal food contact surfaces, if you're in a current facility, think about where your food contacts a certain surface. That could be things like the inside of a mixer or a conveyor, where the outside shell of those is not an animal food contact surface. We also need to think about utensils, like what utensils are actually coming into contact with the product versus those that are not. We need to treat those a little bit differently when it comes to our preventive controls. I think these are going to be our two most common types of sanitation controls that we see in the industry. Number one is going to be sanitizing animal food contact surfaces. Pretty simple there. That makes a lot of sense. I think that's pretty common practice. And then also personnel practices like hygienic zoning. So having established practices and procedures for how personnel act and utilize their utensils, including a hygienic zoning, could be utilized in a sanitation preventive control procedure. There are some different options for how we clean and how we sanitize our food contact surfaces, and I just want to stress that it needs to make sense for your facility, your intended species, and your practices. We often see facilities that don't partake in any wet cleaning whatsoever, and if you're coming from the human food world, that sounds a little bit crazy because we're so adverse to biological pathogens. And those often do require wet cleaning and sanitizing with a chemical agent. But dry cleaning it has an advantage of controlling the water activity or the presence of water in the system. It also may be utilized to protect equipment and make sure that equipment doesn't get gummed up and, cause even more problems. So just keep in mind that there are options out there and you need to do what makes sense for your facility. The preamble does have a really good conversation about when it's sufficient to use wet cleaning versus dry cleaning in a system. So definitely take a look at that if that's something that you're looking to change or just want to be a little bit more informed about. Here's a definition of sanitize. I think we kind of all understand the idea of sanitizing, but this definition is given to us to make sure that we can meet this and understand this definition. This means to adequately treat cleaned surfaces by a process that is effective in destroying vegetative cells of pathogens and in substantially reducing numbers of other undesirable microorganisms, but without adversely affecting the product or its safety for animals or humans. So it's kind of this idea of like to sanitize is a little bit more of an intense word, where sanitation can be just the general practice of cleanliness and using sanitizer, but to sanitize means specifically destroying these pathogens and reducing undesirable microorganisms. Okay? Again, the preamble has a little bit more context and language about what the difference between sanitize and sanitation means, but I think that description gives you a good idea that like sanitation is more of like a general practice, where to sanitize is a specific purpose. Here's some examples of sanitation controls, specifically talking about surfaces. This is going to be appropriate when the destruction of microorganisms is required. You can use systems like steam systems, or you can use chemical agents, but as we saw in that definition, any of those chemical agents that you use, or really any system that you use to sanitize a contact surface, has to be safe as well. You don't want to go through this sanitizing procedure just to introduce a new chemical or introduce a new hazard or increase the likelihood of a different hazard through this process. So just make sure that you're using those chemicals appropriately to get this job done. This is generally more aggressive than routine sanitation procedures that we might see in the preventive control. We're doing more stringent monitoring. We're doing more stringent environmental pathogen monitoring. Surface sanitizing procedures must have all of those components that we've seen in all of the other preventive controls as well. The purpose, the frequency, who's doing it, the steps to do it, how to manage that preventive control, including monitoring, corrective actions and corrections, verification, and records. And here's an example of all of that. So this is another SOP for ABC pet food. This is SOP 201.2, and this is the description of the preventive control of sanitizing the animal food contact surface. And this is going to be our post-extruder surface that we are sanitizing. So this is a surface that we have finished product on. It comes out right after the kill step. So we need to make sure that is absolutely clean, sanitized, and there's no pathogens on that could recontaminate our finished product. So let's take a look at this procedure to kind of see what goes on in this preventive control. Number 1, remove gross material with a squeegee. Wipe the surface clean cloth with a clean cloth dipped in ABC cleaning solution, and I have a formula there, 2 ounces per gallon. Rinse surface with clean water. Detergent remaining on the surface may inactivate the sanitizer. So that's steps 1, 2, and 3. It's kind of just the cleaning step. It's kind of removing that first initial thing of removing the gross product, cleaning it a little bit, and that's probably a pretty good step for getting rid of those pathogens. But because we are more risk adverse and because we decided this is a hazard that needs a preventive control, we're also going to do steps 4 and then 5. So 4 means to spray surface with 200 parts per million quaternary ammonium compound solution, ensuring that entire surface is covered. Sanitizer must contact surface for 1 minute per label directions. And then step number 5, we're going to allow it to air dry for about 5 minutes before we put any product on it. Okay, so it's one more step to make sure this is actually sanitized and we've killed those pathogens. Let's take a look at the monitoring of this as well. What does it look like to monitor this preventive control? Number 1, I'm going to inspect animal food contact surfaces for residual material and cleanliness. Number 2, use test strips to measure the quat concentration before application. Okay, and so I have some parameters that I'm working with there. Number 1, I'm going to inspect for any residual material. And number 2, I'm going to measure that quat concentration to make sure it's adequate, not too much, not too little, before I actually use it. And then I have a procedure to record that on the daily sanitation sheet, so I'm making my monitoring records. Here's another example of a sanitation control. So we're now shifting over to that idea of cross-contamination. or actually preventing cross-contamination. So hygienic zoning, I think, is a pretty common thing that is used in the human food world to control allergens from being cross-contaminated, but it can also be used to control biological pathogens as well. So this is useful to differentiate facility hygiene requirements to minimize product cross-contamination. So all this looks like is partitioning your facility into different zones based on the risk there. So we have non-manufacturing areas like the shop, offices. We're never going to have product in there. So it's kind of a low risk area, where on the other end of that, we've got the pathogen control area. So this is theoretically after a kill step has happened, where we have finished product exposed to the environment, and we need to be really careful to make sure we're not recontaminating it in that particular area. There's basic manufacturing areas as well, and that's usually going to be like our raw ingredients, and we're probably going to have those biological pathogens in there. It's going to be before our kill steps, so while we still need to make efforts to reduce the likelihood and prevent cross-contamination there, it's not quite as high risk as our pathogen control area. And then also thinking about transition areas and how people move between these different sections of your facility and how we can manage those things to minimize cross-contamination. Hygienic zoning can be kind of difficult to plan out, especially when thinking about those transition areas. But it can be done. Things like infrastructure and room air and support areas all need to be taken into consideration. Color coding can be really helpful. Widely communicating all of the expectations with your hygienic zoning practices through all of your personnel is definitely important. I think about like room air and compressed air, making sure that we're not blowing airs, just utilizing our ventilation system in a smart way where we're not blowing pathogens from a raw ingredient area to a finished product area is something that could slip the mind, but definitely something that we need to be diligent about looking at for sure. And then again, like personnel, where are people moving? Where does it make sense to have people move? What kind of procedures do we need to have in place to make sure that we're not preventing or that we're not making that cross-contamination happen? Here's an example of a hygienic zoning map. It's my recommendation that if you are going to use hygienic zoning as a preventive control, that you create a map and make sure you include it in your food safety plan, so that anyone looking at your food safety plan can see where these different areas are and also understand how you treat them differently and what kind of risks are involved in each of these areas. So having the map and having a description of each of these areas, I think, is an important part of a food safety plan that utilizes this as a preventive control. And I think this is pretty easy to use or easy to read here. We can kind of just see that this is like a layout, a basic layout of the facility. And then each one is color-coded based on which of those 4 categories that we already identified that they fall into. Let's talk about management components. So here we are in the second row here of sanitation preventive controls. We are required to do monitoring, corrective actions, and corrections. And then of the verification activities, we are not required to do validation, but we are required to do all of the other things: verification and monitoring, corrective actions, and implementation and effectiveness. I want you to think about why this is. Why is it not necessary, or why is it not required to validate a preventive control? We're going to come back to this idea in a little while, but I want to just kind of plant that seed and try to get you to think about why the FDA decided not to make this a required component for sanitation preventive controls. But let's start with monitoring first. So again, we are required to monitor our sanitation controls, any preventive control. We're going to be producing some paperwork to make sure it's being implemented. So monitoring the critical elements of sanitation process and procedures. We can also monitor if we're using like hygienic zoning or some other personnel procedure, we can monitor that as well. That might be a little bit more difficult, but I think there are ways to do that. For example, if we are using like color coding in our hygienic zoning, like for example, we can have each zone have a different color hard hat, and a simple walkthrough observation could show you whether people are following that procedure by just saying who's got what color hard hats and are they in the right areas. So simple kind of like audits like that, observational audits of those hygienic zoning practices could be a simple way to monitor. Again, thinking about frequency of that though is important in making sure that you're comfortable with the level of frequency you're doing that and that it makes sense for your preventive control. Here's an example of a monitoring record that could be produced, and this goes along with the SOP that we just looked at of sanitizing the post-extruder surface. Again, up top, we've got our good record keeping stuff. We've got the date that it's produced on there. And then if you take a look at the procedure, this looks very similar to the procedure we saw in our description of this preventive control. If you looked closely at that description, you would see that all of this is happening prior to operation and at the end of the day, and we note the time on each one of those. And then through the procedure, this person, who's Chad Smith again, is doing this for us. He's actually going to write in the detergent type and strength that he used every day. So even if he's doing the same thing every day, he's writing it down every day. Same thing with the sanitizing compound. He's writing down every day what he's using and how much. This is also kind of nice if you have different areas that are using different compounds, and they can write those in separately without having to change this form. And then we've got the checks down here, making sure we're letting it dry for at least 5 minutes. And then I have the 2 monitoring procedures that were written out in the preventive control as well. Number 1, that they're inspected for residual material, and that the quaternary ammonium compound was measured to be 200 parts per million. Okay, so then Chad Smith can check that he did those monitoring practices, and now that they're documented. And then take a look at this over here. This monitoring record has a column built into it for corrections. Now, when I first introduced corrections, I told you they were mostly going to be used in sanitation controls, and we're going to see why in just a few minutes, but I wanted to point out the fact that that can be done. This is a simple way that if corrections are going to happen, especially when we're talking about sanitation controls, we can build that into our records to make it a little bit easier on our employees. Okay, and then down at the bottom, I have that good verification activity of Susie Supervisor, and take a look at this now. We also have Frank F. Leader looking at these monitoring records. So in this particular preventive control, because this is a high-risk situation, this facility decided to have 2 people look at these records to make sure that the monitoring is being done and that those corrections and the decisions based on those corrections are being carried out per procedure. So corrections and corrective actions. Remember, this is our second management component. It is required for sanitation preventive controls. These are going to vary depending on the situation, and these might look a little bit different than the process preventive control corrective actions, but this could be things like re-cleaning affected areas, re-sanitizing contact surfaces, and retraining the qualified individual that was carrying out this preventive control. Here's a reminder of what the definition of a correction looks like. This is an action to identify and correct a problem that occurred during the production of animal food without any of those other 4 bullet points. So remember, the regulation piece said that this was a minor and isolated problem that could be identified and corrected quickly, okay? And this is going to be used mostly in sanitation controls, mostly because my preventive control says that I need to clean a surface and then inspect it. And if that surface is not clean, I can just re-clean it without having to do all of these other 4 bullet points. So let's take a look at that in the description of this preventive control. We already looked at the monitoring part, but if we look at the corrections, in the last description that we looked at, the corrections and corrective actions were lumped together, probably because it's not going to happen very often. But look at the corrections on this one. If residual materials observed on a surface, re-clean and sanitize. Simple as that. If quaternary ammonium compound is not at the proper concentration, make a new one, okay? So pretty simple solutions for fixing these things without actually affecting any product whatsoever, okay? And then on my monitoring record that we just looked at, I can just make a little note that says I had to re-sanitize this. Now, if Chad Smith has to re-sanitize or let's say it has to remix the quaternary ammonium compound every single day, that might be a point where we need to take some corrective action that might look like retraining that employee or recalibrating whatever equipment he's using to make that mix of quaternary ammonium. So anyways, where I think this correction idea is going to be more utilized in the sanitation controls, and that's kind of what it was designed for, it can still act as a step for raising a red flag that you need to do some corrective action. And then you'll also notice on this page down at the bottom, the verification piece, we have that description that 2 people are going to be reviewing these records. This table right here again reiterates the differences between correction and corrective action. So let's take a look at each of these. When is this needed? A correction is needed when a minor and isolated problem is identified in a timely manner and does not impact product safety. A corrective action is going to be needed when a preventive control is not properly implemented. Okay, what does this require? For correction, just identifying and correcting the problem, making a little note that it happened and keeping those records. Okay, but with a corrective action, I'm going to identify and correct the problem, reduce the likelihood, evaluate all the affected animal food, prevent it from entering commerce, and reanalyze the food safety plan and document all of those 5 steps. Okay, examples that we looked at for each of these: for correction, an animal food contact surface was not properly cleaned and sanitized. Re-cleaning and re-sanitizing is necessary prior to restarting production. And for corrective action, finished product was manufactured below the parameter value, like that salmonella example we looked at. Reworking is necessary prior to packaging. Okay, and again, repeat corrections is probably a red flag that you need to do some sort of corrective action. So how do we verify sanitation controls? Remember that validation is part of this, and we're not required to validate sanitation controls, but we can verify through a lot of different activities. These are activities that demonstrate that sanitation controls are operating as intended. Remember, we already designed them, we already decided to do them, now they're in place and we need to demonstrate that they're operating as intended. Methods are going to vary. Make sure you do something that makes sense for your facility. But potential examples could be reviewing those monitoring records, reviewing those sanitizing records, or an environmental monitoring program. Okay, so an environmental monitoring program is considered a verification activity that your sanitation controls are working. Okay. Environmental monitoring programs, we're going to spend a few slides talking about those. But again, design needs to make sense for your facility, and it's totally okay to use ATP swabs or indicator organisms. We actually just had some really great research come out about using ATP to identify environmental pathogens. So there's a lot of good procedures and products and science going on right now about that particular process that is much cheaper than actually looking for the pathogen itself. So environmental monitoring for sanitation controls, again, this is appropriate when an environmental pathogen has been established. You know that there's pathogens in the facility for sure, and you want to make sure that you're monitoring those to make sure they don't cross-contaminate your finished feed product. It's maybe required to verify the effectiveness of sanitation controls, like facilities that have finished product exposed to the environment, but it needs to be tailored to each facility. A useful program also diligently tries to find the organism. Remember, the point is to catch anything before it goes out the door. So if you've designed a system where you're avoiding like the most risky parts of the facility, that's not really doing yourself any favors. You need to be really diligent and really searching to make sure you identify when those organisms do become present in your facility. Here's an example, though, of how we can kind of tailor that using our different zoning that we talked about a little bit earlier. So this is kind of a hygienic zoning that's already set up as a preventive control, and now we're verifying that hygienic zoning practice by doing an environmental monitoring program. So on the x-axis, we have the number of samples that we're going to take, and on the y-axis, we have the frequency. And then we've plotted each of our different hygiene zones on this chart. And what we see is that the non-manufacturing areas, we're least concerned about them. There's no product in there. Those people don't ever go out onto the manufacturing floor. So we're going to take the least number of samples at the least frequency. Where on the other end of things, we've got our primary pathogen control area that is finished product, already gone through a kill step, exposed to the environment. I'm going to take the most number of samples at the highest frequency to make sure I'm keeping track of any pathogens that are in that particular area. Transition area is also an important thing because we're going back and forth between manufacturing, between raw product and finished product areas. But then the basic manufacturing area, I want to keep an eye on that, but I also know that some of those ingredients are going to have the pathogen in them regardless. Okay, so the point of this whole graphic is to just reiterate to tailor your environmental sampling program to what makes sense for your setup in your facility and your risk aversion. Within each of those different areas, we can also tailor where we're sampling and what surfaces we're sampling. So this is designed to be like, for example, in our primary pathogen control area, we are now going to take each of those surfaces and put them in categories of zones 1 through 4. Well, zone 1 is going to be our food contact surfaces, and these are our highest priority. This is where our product is actually touching a contact surface that could have a pathogen on it. Sometimes those are going to be difficult to sample just because they are actually used in production, and if you have production going 24/7, 365, that can be difficult to get samples on there. It's not saying you shouldn't, but they can be a little bit more difficult to get. So I think more often in industry we see high sampling happening in zones 2 and 3 because they kind of protect zone 1. If we can keep zone 2 and zone 3 pretty clean and pretty free of pathogens, zone 1 should be pretty good to go as well. Again, you do definitely need to sample zone 1, but the idea here is that we are testing different areas within each of these hygienic areas to prevent our food contact surfaces from getting that cross-contamination. So an environmental monitoring program definitely relies on people and equipment in order to do this verification process. So these are all just things that we need to think about and make sure that we've thought through and set up and designed to make sure that this goes correctly and is actually useful for verifying our preventive control. So this requires training in sampling techniques, so we need to make sure that we have our people trained. Remember that qualified individual piece is making sure you're trained to do your job. So that means being trained in finding likely sampling spots and utilizing those zones and hygienic areas correctly. The tools need to make sense for the pathogen you're looking for or the indicator organism you're looking for, but these could be things like air samples, dust accumulation, floor sweeps, contact plates, swabs, sponges, gauze, and other options. The good news is there is a lot of information and some training courses available to help you establish your environmental monitoring program, especially since we have so much background from the human food world. So if this is something that you're going to implement as a verification procedure, there's a lot of good resources out there. And as I've said several times throughout this course, like go get the information, utilize your resources, utilize the data to help you design a good environmental monitoring program. Now let's take a look at an example of what a sanitation control looks like within a dog and cat food facility. Again, we're in our ABC pet food. Our hazard requiring a preventive control is we rated Salmonella as a high, yes, we need a preventive control. We've got a FDA guidance. And now we're going to focus on the preventive control number 2, which is the sanitation control of post-extruder sanitizing surface. The parameters that we set, we kind of looked at these a little bit as we read through the SOP. Any residual material on post-extruder surfaces and 200 parts per million sanitizer concentration. So 2 things I'm monitoring, and those are my parameters that I'm going to use to monitor them. What I'm monitoring, that visual inspection and the sanitizer concentration. How I'm going to do that? Well, looky there. I have an SOP that I can follow to make sure that I'm doing those things correctly. Frequency before operations begin and end of daily production, and who's doing it? Sanitation team member. Here's our corrective action and correction section, and now this looks a little bit different than the other preventive controls we've looked at. Because this is a sanitation control, we've teased out the correction, and this is exactly what we had on the SOP that we read through. Records that are produced, daily sanitation sheet, corrective actions and correction records, training records, environmental monitoring records. We can also see we're going to be doing environmental monitoring as a verification activity. Here's our descriptions of our verification activities. Again, this is table 3, and I'm going to bring back to this idea of validation. So again, on this table, we have type of validation, and it's listed as an NA. Well, the regulation tells me that sanitation preventive controls do not require validation, so I think that's fine. Again, I would probably err on the side of actually making a statement that says it's not required as opposed to putting NA, just to make sure your inspector knows what you were thinking behind that and kind of limits the questions. However, I've also had some really good conversations with people about what we could validate in this situation and what we could validate with sanitation controls. The reason sanitation controls are not required to be validated is because this is usually a person doing the sanitation for us. Okay, so this is a similar conversation to the example we had about Chad Smith mixing our sheep feed for us. This is a person doing their job, and it's very hard to validate that people can do their jobs. So that's why we left validation out of a sanitation preventive control management component. However, if we're thinking about the parameters that we established, we have a parameter of 200 parts per million of quaternary ammonium. Could I make a statement there about why that's an appropriate level of quaternary ammonium? I think so. And whether that comes from the manufacturer or some validation studies through peer-reviewed literature, I think that's a good idea. And most of the people that I've had come through my classes and have this conversation with feel most comfortable at least putting something like that in this box of validation. Remember, the whole point of validation is justifying that your design is appropriate. So even if it's not required, making a couple statements in there about why you designed your preventive control the way you did, I think is probably going to be a pretty good business practice. Okay. Monitoring and corrective actions, again, I'm just going to verify those records to make sure that those are happening correctly. Verification of implementation and effectiveness. What are my actual verification activities here? I have an environmental monitoring program, and I also do product testing as necessary. Okay, two pretty good verification activities. Reanalysis every 3 years or as necessary. So let's summarize what we went over in that chapter. This is a type of preventive controls that differ from sanitation CGMPs. Remember, we're keeping a closer eye on these guys. We're making more documentation in addition to our CGMP program. These are meant to maintain clean animal food contact surfaces and prevent cross-contamination. They require monitoring, corrective actions and corrections, and verification of implementation and effectiveness, and may require environmental monitoring as part of the verification process. Here is exercise 8. Again, I'm going to have exercise 8 built into one of your assignments for this course, but I want to click through each of these and have you at least think about each of these scenarios. So the idea here is that I'm going to post a statement, and theoretically this statement is related to ABC Pet Food, so we already have some background on them and their preventive controls. And you are going to have to decide whether each of these statements is referring to one of their sanitation CGMPs or one of their sanitation preventive controls. Okay, so this is meant to reiterate the difference between sanitation CGMPs and sanitation preventive controls. Okay, so here we go. Try and just kind of quiz yourself as we go through this. First one. Employees wash their hands and don gloves prior to handling finished product to collect a sample. Does that sound like a CGMP or a sanitation control? The correct answer here is a CGMP. Employees washing their hands before they put on gloves is kind of just a basic foundational thing that all facilities should be doing as part of their foundational cleanliness practices. Okay? Number 2. Floors and walls in the refrigerated ingredient storage area are cleaned and sanitized. CGMP or sanitation control? This one always trips people up a little bit, but I want to clue you into the fact that the floors and the walls are not food contact surfaces, and so this is also meant to be part of the CGMP program. Even though we incorporate cleanliness and sanitized, that can be part of a CGMP program. Okay, next one. The interior of the finished product surge conveyor is cleaned and sanitized prior to beginning packaging. CGMP or preventive control? This one is meant to be a preventive control. We're discussing a food contact surface here, right? The interior of the finished product surge conveyor. We have finished product exposed to something on a surface, so that is meant to be a sanitation preventive control. Okay, number 4. Swabs are collected from the floor between the extrusion, packaging, and warehouse area and analyzed for undesirable microorganisms. What does that sound like? Is that part of a CGMP program or a sanitation preventive control program? This one is also intended to be a preventive control. This should have sounded like an environmental monitoring program to you. That's what they were trying to get you to think about here, is environmental monitoring as verification of a sanitation control. Okay, last one. Surfaces are dried after wet cleaning. That one is meant to be a CGMP. Although we just looked at a description of a preventive control used in ABC pet food, where it specifically talks about letting a wet surface dry after cleaning. Okay, so if you struggled with these, that's okay. There's always some contention in each one of these. And the point is, the idea is that a CGMP, it's going to depend on context, right? So any of these could be in the CGMP program or a preventive control, sanitation control. Okay, it's just going to depend on the decision of the food safety team of whether this needs to be part of the preventive control program, and then what sort of management components we're doing along with that. Okay, I always argue with people in every class about which categories these fall into, and what it comes down to is the context and the design of your food safety system. Okay, there's a couple other things that I just want to throw at you and get you to think about before we wrap up this exercise. We talked briefly about dry cleaning versus wet cleaning, so I want you to really have a good understanding of when those are appropriate and why one would be appropriate over the other. And then thinking about employee zoning, what is that used for? Why is it appropriate? And how would you apply it? Okay, so just kind of think to yourself about those things and be able to answer those questions. To summarize that whole activity, sanitation controls are different from sanitation CGMPs. They're mostly used to prevent cross-contamination of biological hazards. It's impractical for many facilities to use wet cleaning. Whenever it is used, the water sanitizer cannot be a source of potential contamination itself. And hygienic zoning may be successfully used to prevent cross-contamination from employees, but it can be complicated to develop and implement. Okay, and that summarizes Chapter 8 altogether. Hope that was helpful for understanding sanitation preventive controls.